In a life that was exemplary in many ways, Jan Evans was many things to many people. To the people of the Progressive Leadership Alliance of Nevada, the sponsors of this show, she was always an innovator, a counselor, an idea person, and a go-getter. Those that knew her always benefited from her energy, her straightforwardness, and her ability to get right down to the issues. Jan had many, many community activities, most known to the majority of the public as a member of the Nevada State Legislature. She always was open to many things, but particularly known for any of the issues dealing with women and children and the evolving economy of the state. She had many, many community associations, many, many things that she did quietly in private for many, many people. The best thing, though, was her spirit and her ability to keep people talking, thinking, and in action. Jan was a member of the Nevada Assembly, a very prodigious member of the Interim Finance Committee, Assistant Majority Floor Leader, Select Committee on Reapportionment, Chairman Assembly Committee on Health and Human Services. She served on the Advisory Council for the Committee to Aid Abused Women, the American Association of University Women, Western Industrial Nevada, Kids Count Advisory Council for Women's Health Initiative, the Community Advisory Board for Channel 5, the Sparks Heritage Foundation, Sons of Italy, Giuseppe Verde Lodge, and the Sparks Community Chamber of Commerce. She won many awards and recognitions throughout her life, but her life stands as a memorial and a testimony to that, the community involvement that we should all cherish.
Well, first of all, it's always better to have more money than less in terms of meeting all of the state's obligations. But I think we need to examine, first of all, the method that we're using for economic forecasting, and perhaps we are underestimating what these revenue sources will bring in. So there may be a problem in the econometric model. Secondly, I think we can all celebrate the fact that Nevada has had a very strong economy during this biennium. That means business is doing well, people have jobs, there's income, so we're generating sales tax, gaming tax, and other revenue sources that put us in this very healthy financial situation. Well, in years when we have a surplus, and as you'll recall, we had a nice surplus also during the 1995 legislature, you do a couple of things. Certainly you catch up in areas that have been underfunded. One of the things we have not done and we don't want to do is to start a lot of new government programs. And of course there's the temptation to do that, to say we have extra money, so let's do A, B, and C. The problem with that is we have economic cycles, and though things are very good, we have this healthy economy now, it can change. And as you pointed out, it's not just Nevada, it's the nation. And much of our income here, that is certainly in gaming tax, has to do with discretionary spending and visitors coming here. So if the national economy sinks, Nevada's going to go down too. So we have to be very cautious about what we do, not start new programs, fund things that are perhaps one-shot programs, some unmet needs and things like that, so that we're not into the mode of having to cut expenditures unnecessarily in a future year when the economy isn't so good. Some, Bob, will be ongoing issues. We always are struggling with workmen's compensation, questions on SIS. As you know, we have large unfunded liability in workmen's compensation, and so it's important for us to try to get that as solvent as possible. In a few years, we will allow for private insurers to come in. Certainly the issue of infrastructure in the state, Clark County especially, they're hoping to build a new pipeline out of Lake Mead, since they only have one water supply, and the price tag on that is $1.9 billion. Other infrastructure needs, very large, and those of us in the northern part of the state, we have infrastructure needs too, water, sewer, but especially streets, roads, highways, bridges, things like that. But how we are going to do that. There's talk of raising taxes. I don't think there's a lot of appetite for most of us to raise taxes. Will this surplus allow us to catch up on some of those infrastructure needs? Those will be key issues. We'll also have a key issue certainly when it comes to the sharing of revenue between state and local. You know, there's been an interim study on that. There's a proposal to carve up the school districts. Clark County is so large, that's where it started. But here in Washoe County, we have people up at Incline Village who are unhappy. They feel that they put more money in than they get back. Same argument in Douglas County, people up at the lake versus people in the valley. Big decision on whether we keep our school districts intact or whether we divide them into smaller districts. Pros and cons of that, very difficult.
What do you see happening on the issue of, say, campaign finance reform, where it finally came up for a hearing and then at the very closing end of the session, but then died a very shameful defeat at the very last part?
Yes.
Can you give us some of your thoughts on the issue of campaign finance reform?
Bob, it's a kind of a sore subject for me, because I have consistently voted for campaign finance reform, ethics in government. We in the Assembly pass those proposals quite regularly, but for some reason they die when they get into the Nevada Senate. Why they do not succeed, I suppose you have to ask the Senate why they don't have the appetite to do the very things that the voters want. It's not just what we in the Assembly think ought to be done, but what we hear from our constituents and the citizens of Nevada. Important to have accountability, important to have limits on the amount of money that is spent. I think we all feel that we've gone over the top on that. More reporting for lobbyists, just stricter control so people feel that, you know, things are being handled in a proper way. I don't know what to expect in the next session, if there will be very many changes in the makeup of the Senate, but for some reason the Assembly supports campaign reform and the Senate does not. First of all, for quite a number of years, we've seen the sentiment nationwide moving in the direction of greater control at the state level. Some people call themselves, you know, 10th Amendment people, very strict interpretation of the 10th Amendment, those things that are not specified as necessary for the federal government should simply be left to the states. And welfare being one of the national programs, by the involvement of the federal government, you have had at least a certain minimal standard. And maybe that's an argument for federal involvement. On the other side, the argument for more state control, or at least more flexibility allowed for the state, is to say we are 50 states, but we are not all the same. We have unique populations, we have some special problems, and we should be given the flexibility to set policy according to our needs. But in a state like Nevada, where we continue to grow, we can't foresee what the future will hold. Nevada is ahead of the game because we started welfare reform before Washington got around to doing that.
Before
Congress,
either of them did.
Yes. Congress is always very slow to react, and I'm proud to say that a welfare reform package came before the legislature in '95. It was worked on really at the direction of Governor Miller. A statewide task force undertook an examination of welfare system in Nevada and said, suggest improvements, changes, how can we do better? And we implemented that, and I'm sure you've been reading the papers and noticing that we have almost 20% decrease in welfare enrollment in the state. Two reasons, I think, as we pointed out a moment ago: good economy, people getting jobs, but secondly, the emphasis has been on training people when they come in for cash assistance. Instead of saying right away, let's check to see if you're eligible, let's say, what can you do? How can we help you get a job? Do you need some extra education, training, job skills, and so forth? And that's where the focus is. Nevada's future, I think, hinges upon the willingness and the participation of the private sector to step forward and work with our assistance agencies and making sure that jobs are available for those people. Not just to say, we're going to train you, educate you, or whatever. For what? Because if they can only get out of there and go into a minimum wage job, a single parent with a child or two will still have difficulty being self-supporting. We need higher paying jobs, better paying jobs, and we need the participation of the private sector, our businesses, to come say, we understand it's a partnership. We all have a role to play in helping people either stay off, which is more desirable, and if you're on, to help you get off welfare as early as possible. But remember here, we're dealing with very vulnerable populations. We're talking about children, the elderly, the disabled, people who in most cases cannot take care of themselves. And as a state, as a society, we do have some obligations for vulnerable populations. So how this all will work out in the long run, we cannot say. As a case, though, we are ahead in terms of having started welfare reform. More will happen in the next session. But where we land, we do not know yet. And my concern is that over time we will be, we, meaning Nevada, and perhaps other states too, we will be doing more with less.
Yes.
And the reason is we're still a growth state. And whether or not we can keep up remains to be seen.
It's nice to be here, but we're off to the races, and it's almost time for the '99 legislative session. So I thought we'd have a quick little conversation about what you anticipate.
Yes, well, it will be starting very soon, and it's going to be a challenging session. I think, Shane, we're going to have to struggle with a budget problem. We already know that revenue has not been coming in as projected. We'll probably have to do some supplemental funding to a number of agencies, especially education. We have some rather important carryover legislation from the last session. And then very interestingly, we have a new governor. That transition always causes a few wrinkles. First time in 10 years, as you know, Governor Miller was in office for 10 years. So
it's a slightly different ball game.
Yes, very much so.
And of course, Nevada's changing rapidly, which certainly impacts some of the budget concerns. And the world changes.
Yes.
So yeah, it's not 10 years ago.
No.
And we're going into the session before the census.
Yes.
So there's a few little issues there.
Big.
But since one of the most popular movies in the last year gave us that new phrase, follow the money, let's go and follow the money first.
Follow the money.
Okay.
Yes.
And talk about the budget. You're known as a pretty good watchdog for conservative but progressive budgets. Why don't you lead into what you think people need to know about the budget this year?
Okay. Yes, 12 years on the Budget Committee, Vice Chair of Ways and Means, so it keeps me busy. That's my main focus down there, Shane.
And you've read every page, right?
Oh, yes, every line. Check every column to make sure it adds. But unlike the 97 session, where we had additional monies over and above what had been projected, that produced a surplus. Well, what do you do with that surplus? Well, you do a lot of one-time funding. We were able to do some capital projects that were very much in need. Extra money went into those, what we call one-shot funding.
Right.
But this time, we're going to struggle just to maintain our budgets rather than enhancing budgets or taking on new projects. So what comes out this time will be much less ambitious than the 97 session. In terms of the budget, you know, the governor proposes and the legislature disposes. That, I mean, it is the legislature that controls the purse strings, and we have the final say in how much is spent. So I think it happens on two ends. What you just mentioned, that is many of the requests, things that are on people's wish list this time, may just stay in the drawer. It may never make it to the top of the table. That's one part. The other side is people are concerned that because we have a tight budget year, that we may be thinking about raising taxes. That's always a fear. And I can only tell you, after all these years, that is always the last thing that we turn to. It's very much try to hold the line, try to trim where you can, and raising taxes. That's the last consideration. Yeah.
You really try to do a mean and lean, and I do know from personal observation, slicing and dicing.
Yes, we do that too. We do that too.
What do you think will be the first 2 or 3 bills out? The first one's always funding the session.
Yes, yes. And
So
that's always scary because it's millions of dollars, one of the first thing, and it's always difficult for freshmen to be signing off on a bill that right at the beginning of the session you're putting your name to something that is a very large expenditure.
Number, not something most of us carry in our back pocket, but it is sort of our statement about democracy too.
Yes, we have to pay for it.
And that's the first thing out of the chute.
Yes. Well, and just as a footnote to that, the Council of State Governments did a study not long ago ranking the states on the efficiency of their state government and how much it costs per person. And you will be delighted to know, and I'm happy to tell you, that Nevada is one of the cheapo states out there in terms of...
It's most cost efficient.
Cost efficient. Nevadans pay less for their state, the operation of their state legislature than just about anybody. We're in the bottom. This time we're happy to be at the bottom of the barrel.
But it sometimes causes individual legislators a little stress in their own personal lives because part of that bottom is the salary that you don't receive.
I think it's one of the reasons we have a lot of turnover. In the Assembly, for example, there have been sessions where we have turned over 40 and 50% of our membership. Makes it difficult because you have so many new people and they don't know the process.
And they don't have the corporate memory.
Right. You have to look at the job in terms of public service. And I think that is, those of us who have been in for a while very much see our role as public service, even volunteer service, that you happen to get some compensation for. But it is not a high-paying job. Hours are long. Work is hard. It's not glamorous.
But there's some spiritual rewards.
Yes, yes. Two things are worth mentioning right at the beginning, and that is we anticipate having to do what we call a supplemental bill, supplemental funding. When an agency looks like it may not be able to pay its bills by the end of the fiscal year, and of course that would be June 30, 1999, and we are in the 99 fiscal year. They call it a shortfall, appropriately. And we know already, Shane, unless there is just a miracle that happens out there, that we will have to do supplemental funding to education, something called the distributive school account. And that's part of a plan where the state and local entities share the operating expenses of the schools. And because sales tax has fallen so far below projection, the school districts will
Not have
not
their-
make it. They will not make it to the end of the fiscal year without some additional support. I hesitate to quote you a number, but I can tell you right now it will be in the millions. It's not a small sum at all. So that will have to be done.
Well, one of the first questions is, why is there a drop in sales revenue, sales tax?
Yes, well, it simply, from all appearances, the Nevada economy seems good, but it all comes out to projections. We have something called the Economic Forum that, and that's what it is, it's forecasting what the level of tax income will be over a 2-year period. It's tough because, you know, we are a biennial legislature, as you pointed out, so you're trying to look into the crystal ball and say 2 years from now,
Everybody's going to be spending X amount of money.
this is what our income will be, and it has to do with the fact that we were conservative in our projections, or they were, the Economic Forum, for the '97 session, a little more generous in their projections for '99, and it simply has not come to pass.
Now,
First and foremost, we think of public safety, and we don't want lawbreakers to have a slap on the wrist. That the Nevada attitude has always been, you do the crime,
you do the time.
So this is a tough on crime state, and in some ways our penalties are higher and more harsh than other states simply because of that attitude. But you're right, in terms of if we had better educational programs within the prisons, so that when they came out, they would have skills. We do some of that because we have something called a prison industries program where they can learn skills. But, you know, really, it only touches on a small percentage of the inmate population. So, you know, that's an issue. And then, very correctly, you pointed out the drug and alcohol problem, really from two perspectives, and that is lack of adequate treatment. Because if they get out, they will reoffend, and they then will be back in prison, in many cases simply on a technical violation because they've been doing drugs or alcohol. And then the other thing is we have some rather harsh penalties, which we've all voted for drug abuse, drug trafficking, and certainly drunk driving. We have low tolerance for drunk driving, and you're doing prison time. And now I think that part has to be revisited. Not that we should not punish.
Lighten the sentence, but maybe do it in a different manner.
In a different way, and perhaps different types of facilities, rather than using prison beds. There are other kinds of facilities that, you know.
Which brings up the issue, in the last decade, electronics has changed so much. You can do a lot of creative things now with ankle bracelets,
yes,
et cetera, et cetera.
House arrest and electronic monitoring, yes.
Are we exploring any of those?
Oh, we're doing it. We are doing both of those things. Something like electronic monitoring is only appropriate in certain kinds of cases. In other words, for example, if you are a chronic offender, if you're a repeat offender, or if you have committed a violent crime. So those who are lower risk, shall we say, you know, you have to look at the criteria, and so you're not going to put hardened criminals or those who are likely to be violent, you're not going to trust to putting them out there in the community just with an electronic monitor. That won't work. I think the seniority having people in Washoe County, or in, I should say, even northern Nevada, who have longer years of experience is the very thing that keeps the wheels of the legislature turning. Dire predictions about gridlock in the last session. But if you look at the leadership, with few exceptions, the leadership in the committees, the speakership, was all in northern Nevada. We know how to get the job done. Not to denigrate the new people, but they don't understand the process and it takes a longer time. So having experienced legislators means more clout for northern Nevada, and we're able to hold the line against greater numbers from the southern part of the state. And so you don't want this to become a north-south tug of war.
Right.
But as you know, it sometimes happens that way. And that's where experience pays off. In terms of numbers, I'm not a political pundit, so I don't know. I expect that the numbers may narrow a bit in the Senate. I don't know if the leadership would change over. I don't see that happening, but I see a seat or two there that might change, could be vulnerable. And I do expect, too, that the Democrats have a better than even chance of recapturing the Assembly.
Okay. And then, just as a final question, what advice do you have for young people that are considering entering a life of politics, or not necessarily a life of politics, and not necessarily just for young people, but as you mentioned that, you know, politics is a form of community service, and now that term limits for the legislature for 12 years look to be a reality if it's passed in November, more and more people are going to have to take their chance or take their turn in serving.
Right. Yes.
What advice do you have for people who are considering, people like, well, like the producer of down here, Set Free, Kay Crawford, or Sonny Menadue, who's the producer of this program, both of whom I think would make fine candidates. What advice would you have for people like them?
Well, if we have two types of people here. We have the very young, and anyone who is still in their late teens or early 20s, or, well, even beyond that. I shouldn't put a limit on it. But I think education is very important, Bob. I place the highest possible value on my years of working hard to earn my degrees, my university degrees. I think that helped lay a foundation for critical thinking, all of the skills that you need, not just for politics, but for life, expanding your horizons, understanding history, understanding what your country is about, and understanding something more about yourself, self-development, and certainly university exposure I think is important. Beyond that, there are a variety of avenues for anyone these days to enter into community service. Look at whatever your interests are, whether it's seniors, whether it's the environment, children, mental health, the Special Olympics. The list is endless to get involved with people and to learn how to give back.